So welcome everyone. This is the Strategies and Best Practices in Diversity and Inclusion panel. My name is Jorge Calderon, and I will be the moderator of this exceptional group of leaders. Our panel is scheduled for 40 minutes and will include both on-stage discussion and audience Q&A. So in the interest of time, I've been asked to give a brief intro for myself and each of the panelists. And so if I could ask folks to just quiet down that are in the audience, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. So as form of bio for myself, by night, I am a faculty member at Haas. I teach entrepreneurship at the School of Business, and by day, I'm the founder and CEO of Italy. We're a skill building and campus recruiting platform for female college students and employers. In addition to roles in venture capital, management consulting, and technology, I've spent the last 10 years leading and supporting inclusive innovation initiatives. And to my left, we have 5 fantastic panelists. And let me start with Ed. So Ed Sabasaja. Ed is the Director of Human Resources at Intel, where among other talent-related activities, he oversees their global diversity and inclusion initiatives. Ed's impressive background also includes previous engineering and manufacturing leadership roles at Intel, Philips Electronics, and Motorola. Next to him is Laura Gomez, a Twitter alum. Laura is the CEO and founder of Atypica, a startup using predictive technology to help companies improve their diversity and overall hiring. Laura is also a founding member of Project Include, which is a nonprofit advocating for greater diversity and inclusion in the tech industry. And then next to her is Maya Strela Migati. And Maya is currently a managing director at Golden Seeds, angel group investing in women-led startups. She was previously an executive vice president at Marvell Semiconductors, where she also served as interim CEO, co-CEO of Marvell, and was formerly part of Ericsson, where she had a variety of executive positions. Among many other distinctions, Maya was named one of the top 30 most powerful women in Swedish history, which is fantastic. And then to her left, we have Ramla Qureshi. Ramla is a former Fulbright-turned-scholar activist, being one of a few engineers graduating with a civil engineer degree in her class. Ramla began addressing this disparity by starting Women Engineers Pakistan, where she is now the CEO. Women Engineers in Pakistan is dedicating to leveling the playing field for women in STEM. And then to her left is Telly. So Dr. Telly Whitney is currently the president and CEO of Anita Borg Institute, a social enterprise at the forefront of increasing the representation of women technologists in the global workforce. Over her career, Telly has amassed a well-deserved repository of awards, accolades, and honorary degrees. She has also helped start many tech inclusion initiatives, including the well-known Grace Hopper Celebration of Women in Computing Conference, which is coming up and has how many people? 18,000 people? 18,000. So some of you might be actually going to that event as well. So to set the stage, Telly, I would love for you, given your vantage point and what you've been doing with Anita Borg Institute for the last 15 years, set the stage for us. How far has gender inclusion come in technology, and how far do we have to go?
Well, good afternoon, and it's a real honor to be here. There's good and bad going on. I'm an optimist, and I believe that we are making progress in terms of women being at the table creating technology. The bad, we have not increased the percentage of women in a significant way over the last few years, although it is in many places it's slightly going up. But there's a lot more women overall going into computer science and engineering. The good news is that we are talking about it. There's some very courageous souls who have really spoken their truth, Ellen Powell being one of them, but Susan Fowler and others, who are really bringing some of the issues to the forefront. And by speaking their truth, it allows us to address some of the issues. I will tell you that we know what to do. The thing that I know is that there are companies that are making a difference, Intel being at the forefront. where they have support from the top, they have well-established diversity programs, and I mean, I've seen the difference. We also see that in universities. We're involved with the BRAID program. Harvey Mudd has 50% women in computer science. So we know what to do. What we don't always see is organizations willing to make the commitment and difference.
Great, thank you, Tali. And speaking of organizations that are actually doing something, Ed, tell us a little bit about Intel and what they're doing around gender, or what you're doing around gender inclusion.
So the journey of Intel, as many of you may know, we started a few years back where the CEO made a statement by basically he went ahead and put together a $300 million fund to actually drive diversity, not just in gender, but across all various different chasms that you have. You have diversity of innovation, of thought, of gender, etc. I can go on and on. But basically, with this kind of commitment, we've been able to put in place processes and structures that allow us to then go after the problem in a very structured way. And so the numbers that you see us publishing in our annual reports or media reports talk about representation, but they also speak to other categories of diversity that you actually get, gender being one of them. And I believe that the approach that we're taking is absolutely going to yield better results as we continue to work the problem. We also work with various different stakeholders, not just within the company, but outside of the company, to make sure that we're learning from other aspects of the industry. So it's a problem that's bigger than Intel, but we do have a methodology that we're using to actually go ahead and approach it.
That's great. And Maya, I know obviously you have a background in the corporate world as well. I know you're turned into an investor now. But what have you seen from either your experience at Marvell or Ericsson in terms of, especially around gender inclusion initiatives and programming?
If we talk about Ericsson, that is a big global company, 140 years old and headquarters in Sweden, which is very much focused since many, many years back on gender equalities and inclusion and so on. So Ericsson was very, very strong in that, and I was one of the senior leaders that actually pushed Ericsson to form Global Diversity and Inclusion Council. And since you have company in so many different cultures around the world, you really have to focus on something that would benefit a company. It's not the same situation for Ericsson in Saudi Arabia and Ericsson in Finland or in China, very different situation. So we started that council in order to figure out where we are as a company. We did a lot of different internal polls, and we decided to actually everybody has to do unconscious biases training and understanding. And I myself figure out that I also have a lot of biases towards the man, how many things they can go at one time and so on. So big companies have that advantage that they have resources, and many of the big companies already have part of their culture, inclusion and diversities. So I believe that smaller companies like Marvell was, that even didn't address that, have a journey to do, but they have to go from their own internal structure and statistics. So at Marvell, that was not positive at all, but we didn't have time to move there because there were other more urgent matters to attend. But I would say that there are companies in Silicon Valley, like for example, Intuit or GoDaddy, that really have done fantastic things in a diversity inclusion, and they can be studied.
Great. And Ramla, when we think about kind of the global perspective in underdeveloped worlds or developing countries, tell us your perspective on kind of the role that corporates play in improving gender inclusion.
Sure. Well, the entire game changes when you go into a developing country, because most of the methods and techniques for creating the conversation around diversity and inclusion do not really directly apply back there, because then you have so many layers of culture and tradition and years of interpretations of religion that come in forward when it comes to having women work in a male-dominated area with providing, so Pakistan has a majority that follows one religion, but there are minorities as well. So how do you include them when it comes to their holidays, religious holidays? So there's a lot of questions that are way off that we aren't even talking about yet, because we're still working on the base level at this point. How do we get more women to talk about this, at least start the conversation, get the ball rolling? So I feel like now there's been a global trigger for getting more and more women into STEM fields. And I think Pakistan is not that far behind in following that trigger, but there's still a lot of ground to follow.
Fantastic. And then I know we talk a little bit about corporates. Let's talk a little bit about kind of the entrepreneur sector. Laura, tell us a little bit about kind of your experience as a startup founder and the work you're doing with Project Include.
Well, we see the headlines around female founders, and we also see who on the other side is making those decisions towards funding entrepreneurs and just general any founder. And so when we see about 90 to 95% of venture capitalists being men, and then on the other side, only about 6 to 8% of female founders getting funded, it's very correlated to the fact that there are many biases. I believe that there was a study actually out of Sweden on the words and the terminology used to describe female founders versus male founders. There is a risk adverse towards a woman, female founders that have the same sort of mentality as male founders, but they seem to be riskier when it's attributed or it's tied back to a female founder. I've been in rooms where there were 150-something male founders and there were only 8 female founders. And it is really concerning because female founders will think about diversity and inclusion earlier than their male counterparts. They will think about other ways and benefits. Even at my seed stage company, I'm already thinking about parental leave, bereavement leave, and my bereavement leave also includes if there were, unfortunately, reproductive issues with women, if that's part of mourning. And so like a lot of our male counterparts actually don't think about those things later on. They think about policies like working from home, and they don't think about the gender responsibilities in that decision. With Project Include, as one of the other 7 women, we have about 150 years of experience. And Project Include, along with Ellen Pao and Frida Kapor and a lot of other great women, we have but a program called Startup Include for male founders to think about all of this. We recommend that at 25 employees, everybody should hire a dedicated person to think about diversity and inclusion outside of the HR role. It has to be across the whole function. And so right now my company is 12 people, and by next year there will be about 25, so I have to start thinking about that. I can't just preach it. I have to start thinking about, do I need to have a diversity and inclusion to think about how we're going to scale? And yes, even me as an advocate, as a woman, as a person of color need to be held accountable to the same standards that we hold our male founders accountable for.
So it seems like gender inclusion 20 or 30 years ago was a conversation that was actually in corners. Right? Now it's a little bit, the conversation is more external, mainstream. People are talking about it. I think you pointed out that there's corporations, entrepreneurs, et cetera, that are doing something and advocates that are doing something about it. So I'd love the panelists to think about, given the current pace of change, how many years till parity in gender inclusion in technology? And Tali, if you want to start us off, like what?
Well, according to a recent Lean-In and McKinsey study, at the current rate of change, it would be 100 years before we had parity at the leadership level. So we are on a very slow pace that will take time.
Okay. So I want to get 1 or 2 people, and then I'm going to come back to you all and ask you what's going to increase our rate of change. So if anybody else want to take a stab at their thought of how long?
I can comment on that. I think in regards to technology, especially engineering, electrical engineering, a little bit less on STEM, we are going backwards. If you want to employ 30% of females in your company, you have to have that pool of resources outside, and this pool is getting depleted because there are less and less women girls that take STEM or engineering, and the statistic is working against that. So till probably maybe 200 years or something, but it's not really like that. Everything depends on a K1 to K-12 education, on a role model for the girls that are in high school, on the way how STEM subjects are taught. So I believe if society and education put enough effort into equalizing approaches of the girls and boys towards STEM subjects, we are going to improve amount of statistics for the female students. And then on top of that, within the corporate America, we have to work that the situation for female engineers become equal as a guy engineer, that we don't have places like what we have seen in some companies that were highly rated, because this is also another thing that actually many of the girls that have to take next step and choose like engineering will step down because it's so harsh to be one of two women in the team and you will be excluded.
So, Ramla, you're in a underdeveloped country, but it's almost like a greenfield opportunity. There may be less systemic issues, maybe not. Can you tell us what your perspective is? How quickly can a country like Pakistan move towards gender parity?
I think the change is pretty exponential at this point, considering that we had so much ground to cover, and with this global push into technology, we've really started pushing forward to that. However, I think there's one very important factor in getting this thing done is to get the male side of this conversation to talk actively about it. At Women Engineers Pakistan, we make sure that at least 20% of our campus teams are boys. Mm-hmm. So when they go and speak to high school girls about engineering, they're encouraging the young girls that, okay, I can do engineering as well, but they're also inculcating within their own mindset that it's okay for a girl to come into engineering. So when they graduate, they're going to be more welcoming to female counterparts within the engineering. So unless the majority starts speaking about it, I mean, the minority can't be the only one fighting about it over and over. And I think that applies to every majority-minority conversation. There has to be a conversation over and over and over again, especially in underdeveloped countries where we can make that leap without having to go through all this trial and error that developed countries had to go through, because we have case studies now that we can learn from.
Got it. And is there anybody else on the panel that thinks that we can achieve this in less than 100 years at the current pace?
I do.
All right, Laura?
Atypica is a data-driven company, so we look at public data, government data, we look at census data, university and education, and I look at internal data from clients in tech. So we look at benchmarks. And in the past 7 years, the reason that there's more women in tech, whether in technical roles or non-technical, it's really led by women. Women were applying on more jobs, they're accepting more offers. And so one client of ours that in 2010 had a 3% applicant pool of technical females now has about a 28% pool. So I think driving by data, we also see millennial women actually pushing for more change, and we see studies after studies. So I always say that it might be a longer time for female founders to get the same equal treatment as male founders. So I have nieces, and I hope that they can be entrepreneurs themselves. Do I think that that's going to be the case? I don't know. I think once we shift into an industry that has representation of women, more women will then start becoming entrepreneurs, and then it will shift there will be successful exits, it'll be shift the mentality. But I do think that given the data out there, I think that there is, I don't know about parity, but there will be much more representation than we saw a decade ago, and I think more than we will probably see in the next 15 to 20 years.
Okay, so it sounds like in many ways your suggestions are K1 through K12 needs to have more STEM, more encouragement, especially for women. And then also men have to be part of the equation, supportive, helpful, whether it's the folks that are working or being a parent, right? Being a parent and being good to your daughters and telling them that STEM is an opportunity for them. And then highlighting and recognizing more women who are already successful, elevating them, et cetera. And that seems like those things will certainly move this systemic change. But what's the one or two things that we have to get over that are the biggest hurdles that are impeding us from faster progress around this? Is it culture? Is it holistic system issues? Ed, I don't know, maybe you have some viewpoint on that.
Yeah, well, I think that there's pieces of culture and pieces of the systemic issues that, and also there's a piece about the cultural way in which we're trying to solve a problem the same way. And I believe that there are pieces, I align with the statement that when you look at the data and look at the critical mass of women building up in various different roles of responsibility, that in itself will be self-fulfilling, and perhaps you'll get more acceleration towards attraction of more women actually coming into the industries or even getting into STEM as a pathway into getting into technical education and also roles within various different industries. But I think that we need to stop just thinking about solving the problem one way. And what I mean by that is there has to be other ways in which to engage, for example, the counterpart male population to really be more involved. The incentives for them to also be able to come to the table and help solve the problem is something that needs to be worked on, because you can't just have half the population of the world focused on one thing and then the other half doing something completely different. I also believe that the better we get more incisive in terms of the data that we're looking at to really understand the problems at very discrete levels as to why and how we can actually enable more kids to be attracted towards STEM and other vehicles that get them into the technical realm, the better we'll get at being able to solve these problems. So don't just look at the problem the old way in which you've looked at it. You know, you have to be able to come up with new ideas, and that's what we need to actually go off and do in order to solve this problem and accelerate its resolution, if you will.
So Ed, if you don't mind answering the next question too, what can Intel or what are they doing around childcare, maternity leave, things to support women who want to continue to excel in their careers and still have a family and have some balance?
So we've had innovation around those benefits, if you will, but really where we've been, I think, had some breakthrough see-through things that have enabled us to actually now get better attraction is in the way in which we think and allow our leaders to think, and then the way in which we actually also incentivize our leaders to think that way. Having more critical mass of senior leaders across the various different stacks of management has also driven that thought of innovation around diversity to really change. Most people think about the cognitive bias of diversity, which is what you see is all there is. But it's really the thought of diversity which is really key. And having more women in a room will force you to really perhaps go through a different process of the design exercise as opposed to having a room full of men, or a room full of engineers who are men. So Intel really looks at all those interactions. We measure each of those interactions to try to make sure that we are introducing any opportunity to become more diverse in any of those interactions is very key, because that's how you actually drive your innovation forward, and that's how you change the game, if you will. Otherwise, if you let the natural process manage itself, you'll get the same old result that you always get.
Thank you. Telly.
So we have something called the Top Companies Program, where we actually measure. We have well over 60 companies participate. And I mean, first of all, I would say that what you measure, you will change, as Ed said. I think it's really important. But there was 3 policies that those that were doing better had and one was flexible time. So it's being able to come in. I mean, different companies implemented it differently. But the second is leadership training, and the third is diversity training. If you look at what the social science says is that women leave because they don't see advancement. It's not because of factors like childcare. I mean, those are important, and don't get me wrong, but they want to see how they can get ahead.
Thank you, Telly. That's important. And for those that are interacting with entrepreneurs, so Laura, Maya, and Ramla, what are you either telling your companies that you're associated with around supporting women, whether it's through family, childcare, flexible time, et cetera? What are you telling the startups to think about early that's going to change that potential barrier?
So one of the things that I've noticed is that for early stage startups, more women don't join earlier stage startups. And it's sort of where they may not have the mentorship or the support or have the benefits or packages that later stage tech companies, when there are companies, they're no longer startups. So I tell them about all the benefits if the startup is successful, that they have more equity, or that they need to be earlier in the game to try to set that tone for other women. And so I think one of the challenges is telling other founders that they need to start thinking about attracting talent earlier on, and the women need to start demanding that change earlier on in the stage of the startups. It's hard for me. I mean, I have a startup, and I've tried and I've done all I can to actually attract more females into my startup, but because we're earlier stage, we're riskier. And I understand that, so it's always about the mentorship and the support that people can get earlier on. But I also say that the benefit is that they're able to establish what it should be a more gender equitable culture if they go into an earlier stage startup by unfortunately not educating, but surfacing the issues that women have at earlier stage startups versus the later stage startup. I remember being at Twitter, and my team was among the first to actually take maternity leave, and in the state of California, it's a disability, and I was very shocked, and obviously I was full-time manager, so learning those learning curves, but also the mentorship that they are able to get at larger companies is really crucial, but they can get that as well at a smaller startup. They just have to really ask for it, ask for a coach. I've had mentees ask for coaches when they're one of 15 employees, ask the CEO, the male CEO, that they want a coach, and they're able to accommodate quite frequently, and I think that that's a progress that is positive on the growth of their own professional advancement.
So Maya, I know you're at Golden Seeds now, and you're advising and investing in companies similar to Deepika. Can you talk a little bit about your conversations with them around gender inclusion and the different strategies around that?
Let me first mention a little bit that this comes from economic forecast that was in January this year. From 2008 to 2016, the wealth of Americans have doubled, the home money. So from $4.5 trillion that just sit in the bank to $9 trillion that is sitting in the bank. Half of that money women hold, but they do not invest that money. There are no really proper investment and VC that would be entirely women. It's primarily, as Lara mentioned, it's male-dominated profession, and everything around that one is very different dynamics. So I belong to investment firm Golden Seeds, which is focusing only on women-led companies. Woman has to be CEO, founder, co-founder, has to have one of the C roles in the company. And when we discuss that, in early investment, the seed, you really do not discuss these things. Investors are really just focused on two things: how much money you're going to make, when you're going to make your exit. But there are, in the companies that are led by women, if you go to the discussion about due diligence to see how much commitment you're going to get from the team, then you clearly see, as Lara has been talking, that the people dimension is very strongly present. And then means also everything what Lara mentioned, talking about how people should feel comfortable, commitment to the company goes. If you are getting all the benefits, that company walks extra mile for you, you will walk even stronger for that company. And I have seen that in several companies that I have invested, how the company work and preparing for go to the next stages. And then the culture of diversity has to build from the start.
Great, thank you. And Ramla?
Well, in Pakistan, we recently had a competition called She Loves Tech, where they had a mandatory requirement that one of the co-founders had to be female, at least. So I think this sort of incentive-based competitions can really tease out the hesitance that startups feel or women feel before joining a startup. This can really, really help them to come forward and let go of that the hesitance. So I think it's also very much a subconscious culture for women, because like Laura mentioned, that women themselves are not very likely to be the founding members of a startup. They will join in after a while. So for such competitions, I suppose, especially in countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, can be really, really helpful to get the other half of the country involved into the actual bigger picture.
Great. One of the things that we teach at Berkeley is to essentially start companies with core values that already have gender and inclusivity engaged into the company. So it's part of your startup DNA, and it's DNA that will essentially be permanent in your companies as they grow. So establishing some way of actually making a permanent fixture of your company and guiding the way that you do work is really important. And I think you can do that through core values, culture, et cetera. So on the panel, one last question, then we'll get to questions from the audience. If you had any number of dollars to put towards a experiment, something that you feel like could move the needle, nobody's done it, or maybe somebody's done it, but you want to do it in a bigger way, what would that experiment look like?
Well, so I believe that the way that you create diversity is to start from the top. That if you, that I've watched, and I've actually watched with leaders where they make a commitment and they have a partner with the head of diversity or somebody else, so they can create programs and they can track progress. And so if you had money to invest, I would invest it in training a set of leaders to make a difference, because as you show more examples of how to do it differently, I believe it would catch on.
Great, and I think that was something that Laura had mentioned as well, is try and start from the top in terms of leaders. What else? Anybody else have?
I would put it in a program, educational program for K1 to K12, because US education K1 to K12 is the biggest problem for this country. Non-recognized by current government, but it is, and I would put gender diversity embedded with STEM education from K1 onwards and make it compulsory for the whole of US.
That's great.
It's really utopia.
Yeah, and I think the research says that women are equal in interest until about 6th or 7th grade, and then there's a huge drop-off during our awkward years, as you were. Yep, great, fantastic. And then anybody else? Yep.
So I would say my role model for this would be my mother. I'll give you an analogy that, okay, so public transportation in Pakistan is not as convenient as it's here. You have to really hang on to the bus so that you don't fall off. The way my mother raised us was that she would send us in one bus and say, okay, I'll catch the next one. You go ahead. This was the way she inculcated confidence in us, that, okay, we knew that she has our back. She's coming right there. If we get stuck into something, she'll know. But that way, I had enough confidence to sort of maneuver through my day into a public bus with 60 other people crowded together. So I think we need to do that to young girls here as well. We need to provide some confidence. Yeah, we're there. When I have a daughter, I would probably do something of that sort as well, that, okay, you are capable enough, you have enough confidence in you. We really need to push girls forward, because there's a severe lack of confidence when it comes to STEM studies, at least.
Great, so we've heard training in leaders, training at the K1, K12, instilling confidence in our young women. What else?
So I grew up in Silicon Valley, the daughter of a nanny and a house cleaner to a lot of tech leaders. And so I think I would be doing a disservice to not talk about the different types of diversity, not just gender, but intersectional, racial diversity, disability, sexual diversity. But one of the things that I would go with my mom to clean houses, and I always wanted an apprenticeship in high school. So I would actually, and I wrote a blog post about this, give apprenticeship to people that are contract workers or service workers, like either drivers of buses at tech companies or cafeteria, or like food workers and or like nannies or gardeners. I would set up an apprenticeship program for their children to get to understand tech. And so I think that if I were to do that, I think that would be probably where I would put the money. I know that Microsoft has an apprenticeship program up in Seattle, but I think Silicon Valley needs something similar here, especially since that those sort of, 1099 workers really would probably benefit, and their families, from getting exposed to tech.
Great. So another fantastic access to learning opportunities for a wider audience. Fantastic. Ed, your thought?
Yeah, my thought would be around, I think, simplifying how we communicate even ideas to different sectors of the progression of people from early stages of education up to adulthood we can do a better job than that. I don't think we communicate enough, or even the concentration of that communication is not accurate enough to reach people enough at an early age whereby they can really understand the true benefits of investing in either STEM education, etc. As advanced as we are with innovation in communications, I still think there's a lot of way to go to actually simplify how to get these messages across, and that's what I would invest in.
That's great. So I think as a panel, it's all about learning and knowledge and the transfer of that information and opportunities and giving confidence and knowledge about tech and STEM. That's fantastic. So with that, let me make sure that we have folks in the audience ask questions. I think there is a speaker right in the middle. All right, we have somebody walking over.
Sorry, those lights are so
They are very
glary.
bright.
So my name is Margarita Colmenares, and when I graduated with an engineering degree from Stanford, the statistics for Latina women was less than 0.1%. I have dedicated a good portion of my life, besides doing technology. Today I'm with a startup. We want to desalinate water. We're seeking visionary impact investors with patient money. In the STEM area, I was the first woman to lead the Society of Hispanic Professional Engineers, which increases the number of Latinos and women in engineering and science. You all had such great recommendations, but could you share with the audience, in your own experiences, what have been some of the stumbling blocks? I mean, why can't we get there? Because everything that each of you said contributes to helping increase the diversity, but what is it that's stopping us?
Great. I think some of you mentioned culture, systemic issues. Anybody want to tackle that?
Accountability. I mean, there's a large resistance. I mean, you're hearing people who believe in this, but there are many people who don't. And there's no consequences for not creating change. So I really believe that the more that you can add accountability from the government or other places, that can make difference.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I tend to agree that accountability is definitely one thing. And the other thing, too, is there's multiple different approaches, no standardization. And the lack of standardization, how you look at things, it can drive divergence in terms of being able to execute on a mission that, one would think would be so simple. But I think that divergence manifests itself in many ways. And in fact, the lack of a focused kind of approach then leads to dilution of some of the ideas that we've talked about. And unless you get that critical mass thinking about things the same way and also trying to bring along those ideas and execute them, and with the right accountability, you can't get results. And that's what you're seeing.
Anybody else? Ramla?
I just want to say it's a marathon, it's not a sprint. So we have to keep going. We have to keep pushing forward. It's fine if we're going slow, as long as we're going forward.
I think, and I have to say that back to the allies, I have seen personally the learning curve of my Latino brothers on how to be better allies to their Latina hermanas. First and foremost, always seeing that sometimes it is forgotten, and so I think it is a constant reminder that we're still here and that we are fighting that. And congrats to you to being the first president or the first woman to lead ship that has been around for a long time. But I think it is holding accountable not only others, but within our own communities as well, especially those that have to help us and elevate us in that process.
I think, and I'll add my 2 cents on this, I think for any change, the biggest barrier is complacency. And too often, either men and or women are complacent and not being proactive around this issue. They might talk about it, but they don't really do any action around it. Or they might hear it, but they don't actually do anything about it. So one of the big things is to get rid of complacency, have people and encourage people to get involved in some way. Any other questions? Any one last question? We have about 0 seconds left. Okay, good. Well, with that, I just wanted to thank this fantastic panel. You guys have been wonderful. These guys, give them a hand, please.